In the 19th century, cities like London were running out of room for the dead. Cemeteries were full, diseases were spreading, and funerals were no longer just local affairs. Something had to change. That change came by rail. In 1854, the London Necropolis Railway began transporting bodies and mourners from the city to vast new cemeteries in the countryside, using dedicated funeral trains. Within a decade, America would take that idea even further. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, his body traveled across more than 1,600 miles of track so that the public could say goodbye. That journey redefined funeral trains, not just as a necessity, but as a symbol. What began as a solution to urban burial problems became a national ritual reserved for the most powerful figures in modern history. So, what were these trains really like? How did they work? Who got one? And what happened to the engineers, cars, and people who rode with the dead? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the complex history of funeral trains. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start today with an uncomfortable fact. For centuries, the dead were carried through narrow city streets, escorted by mourners or clergy. In small towns, a funeral might end just a few steps from where it began, but as cities expanded and population surged, this model broke down. Urban centers in the 1800s were crammed with people and, sadly, disease. Hence, cemeteries overflowed, graveyards sank, and the stench of decay was a public concern. And it was no small nuisance, since the risk of cholera and typhoid were real. Death, once a private ritual, became a logistical crisis. Nowhere was this more evident than in London. By the mid-19th century, the city's burial sites were so overwhelmed that Parliament stepped in. What followed was a strange mix of enterprise and necessity: the London Necropolis Railway. Founded in 1854, it was a fully functional train line designed exclusively to transport coffins and mourners from central London to a massive new burial ground in Surrey Brookwood Cemetery. This was no symbolic gesture, it was infrastructure. The service ran daily, with separate cars for different social classes. Even in death, class distinction held firm. Coffins were loaded at private stations near Waterloo. Mourners followed. The trip lasted less than an hour, but for the dead, it was a one-way ticket. The idea worked, and other cities took note. Vienna experimented with electric funeral trams, and in the United States, long-distance funeral trains were used during wartime to bring fallen soldiers home, especially during the Civil War. But these early trains were still, at their core, functional. It wasn't until 1865 that the funeral train took on a new national purpose. Abraham Lincoln died in the early morning hours of April the 15th, 1865, shot at Ford's Theater just days after the Civil War effectively ended. His death came not as a final chapter of war, but as the beginning of a national reckoning. The funeral service in Washington was solemn, but the real farewell was only beginning. On April the 21st, Lincoln's body was placed aboard a special train that would carry him back to Springfield, Illinois. The journey was no simple transit. It was a 1,654-mile procession engineered to stop in every major city that had marked his path to the presidency 4 years earlier. This train, called the Lincoln Special, became a kind of mobile cathedral, moving slowly enough for the country to gather, weep, and remember. The train consisted of 9 cars. Among them was the presidential car, United States, originally constructed for Lincoln's use in his second term. Also aboard the train was the casket of Lincoln's son, Willie, who had died 3 years earlier from typhoid fever. Initially interned in Washington, D.C., his remains were exhumed to accompany his father on this final journey to their resting place in Springfield. Joining them were a military honor guard, government officials, clergy, and members of Lincoln's staff. About 300 passengers in total. William H. Gould, the conductor of the train, oversaw its initial departure from Washington. He later described the moment the casket was loaded. According to a clipping from the Washington Evening Star, Gould recalled the way, quote, crowds gathered even before sunrise, standing atop fences and lampposts just to glimpse at the train as it pulled away. Gold continued working for the railroads for decades after this, and his name remained tied to Lincoln's final journey until his own death many years later. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun referred to him simply as, quote, Lincoln's conductor. The Lincoln Special traveled through Baltimore, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York City, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and of course, Chicago. In 13 of the cities, the coffin was removed and carried to a state house or city hall for public viewing. In Buffalo, nearly 100,000 people passed through St. James Hall in just one day. In New York, the casket was displayed inside City Hall under a massive blank canopy guarded by soldiers as citizens filed past for hours. Every stop had its own character. Some cities welcomed the train with bands and wreaths, whereas in the countryside, people lit bonfires and stood along the tracks to honor the deceased president. The itinerary was published in newspapers days in advance, which meant that even towns where the train didn't stop, people were waiting in observation alongside the tracks. One woman in Ohio wrote in her diary that she had waited for, quote, 8 hours besides the rail, just to see the windows of the president's car. She never saw Lincoln, but she wept anyway. On May the 3rd, the train finally arrived in Springfield, where Lincoln was laid to rest the very next day at Oak Ridge Cemetery in a tomb built on a hillside. Today, it remains one of the most visited presidential burial sites in the country. As for the train itself, its fate was far less dignified. The United States car was sold to Union Pacific and changed hands several times before being destroyed in a fire in 1911. Only fragments survived: railings, plaques, and some photographs. But in 2014, engineer Dave Cloak and his team unveiled something extraordinary: a full-scale, functioning replica of Lincoln's funeral car. Built using original blueprints and outfitted with period furnishings, the replica toured parts of the original route in 2015 to mark the 150th anniversary. Anyhow, Lincoln's death was the start of a new tradition. And when the next president died suddenly in office 8 decades later, the train tracks would again become part of a national ritual. Franklin D. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, at his retreat in Warm Spring, Georgia, and the news of his death hit the nation like a second shockwave after 4 years of total war. The following morning, preparations were underway to return his body to Washington by train, a journey that would span 3 days and over 1,000 miles, connecting the nation to its longest-serving president one final time. The train assembled in Warm Springs wasn't a custom funeral convoy. It was a modified configuration of the rolling command center Roosevelt had relied on for years. At the heart of this formation was U.S. Car No. 1, also known as Ferdinand Magellan, built in 1929 and heavily reinforced in 1942 for presidential use. It was a rolling fortress, bulletproof steel armor, 3-inch thick windows, and a sealed exterior that made it secure, but ironically, unusable for a state funeral. Roosevelt's casket couldn't be viewed through its armored plating, and so the casket, as well as the deceased president, traveled in a separate car, a Pullman sleeper lounge named Conneaut. The casket was placed in the lounge area, secured and surrounded by military escort, with members of his inner circle riding alongside. The locomotive that pulled the train from Georgia to Washington was Southern Railway's PS-4 number 1404, a Pacific-class steam engine known for its reliability and speed. Today, it's preserved at the Smithsonian as a relic of when it pulled more than just passengers, but the weight of a grieving country. The train departed Warm Springs around 9 a.m. on April 13th, 1945. It passed through towns like Atlanta and Raleigh, then onto Richmond, and eventually Washington, D.C. As the train passed through the South, thousands of citizens gathered along the tracks, many in uniform, some saluting and others weeping. When the train arrived in D.C.'s Union Station, Roosevelt's body was ultimately transferred to the White House for a private East Room service. Then, just as quickly, it returned to the tracks, this time headed north to Hyde Park, New York. On April the 15th, the funeral train arrived at Springwood, Roosevelt's family estate. The president was buried in the Rose Garden, in a simple grave marked with his name birth, and death. But this train didn't just disappear. The Ferdinand Magellan returned to service almost immediately. President Truman would later ride it during his 1948 whistle-stop campaign, logging over 22,000 miles. It was officially retired in 1958 and now rests at the Gold Coast Railroad Museum in Miami, where visitors can actually step inside the preserved compartments once occupied by FDR himself. As for the Canyad, its post-funeral history is less certain. It did not become an object of national memory. Unlike the Ferdinand Magellan, or the locomotive that pulled it, this carriage just slipped into obscurity. While high-profile funeral trains began as a somewhat distinctly American phenomenon, the concept wasn't limited to the US. In rare cases, the rails were also used to honor towering figures abroad as well. Winston Churchill died on January the 24th, 1965. 6 days later, the British government carried out one of the most complex and solemn state funerals in its history. The service was held in St. Paul's Cathedral and broadcast to over 350 million people around the world. But the real final act of the funeral didn't take place in the cathedral, or even in London. Rather, it took place in a train. After the service, Churchill's coffin was carried to Tower Pier and loaded onto a boat called the Havengor, which took it up the Thames in view of the Houses of Parliament. From there, the body was taken to Waterloo Station. Waiting on Platform 11 was the funeral train, a composition planned years in advance under the code name Operation Hope Not. At the front of the train stood a locomotive that bore Churchill's name. It was none other than engine 34,051 Winston Churchill, part of the Battle of Britain class. The locomotive had been in service since 1946, and when it was first named, Churchill himself objected. He didn't think locomotives should bear the names of living people, but now it was hauling a casket, so perhaps it fit. Behind it, the coffin was loaded into a specially converted Southern Railway hearse van, number S2464S. That van had been quietly set aside for Churchill all the way back in 1962, painted in Pullman-style brown and cream, and kept in pristine condition for this very moment. The rest of the train consisted of Pullman coaches reserved for the family and close officials. The train left London on the Southern Region line and traveled west. It wasn't a long journey, but it was meaningful. Spectators stood behind fences and station platforms. Some saluted, some didn't. The train stopped at Hamborough Station, where Churchill's coffin was transferred once more, this time to a hearse that took him to the churchyard of St. Martin's in Baldon. There, next to his parents, he was buried in the soil of the country he had defended with words and willpower. As for the train, well, remarkably, all of it survived. The engine was immediately retired after the funeral and preserved at the National Railway Museum in York. The hearse van vanished for a time. It was sold off, repurposed, and nearly forgotten, until it was rediscovered and restored in the 2000s, when it was repainted and returned to public display. Every Pullman car was also kept intact. Each one has been restored to reflect its condition on that fateful day in January of 1965. This would be the very last time the UK sent off a leader by rail, but back home in America, the tradition would soon continue, this time for a fallen senator whose life and death mirrored the turmoil of a new era. Robert F. Kennedy had just won the California primary when he was assassinated just after midnight on June the 5th, 1968, in the kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The day after, his body was flown to New York and laid to repose at St. Patrick's Cathedral. 3 days later, following a requiem mass, he was placed aboard a funeral train bound for Washington, D.C. The train left Penn Station on June the 8th at 12:30 p.m., pulled by a pair of Pennsylvania Railroad GG1 electric locomotives, number 4901 and 4903. This was a 21-car train, with the final car being an observation carriage containing a flag-draped coffin, positioned at the open platform on the rear. The public couldn't board, but they could watch it pass. The train was loaded with about 700 passengers, including Kennedy's family, staff, and press. And as the train made its way south, something tragic happened that no one expected. Thousands of people were lining the tracks, and things turned deadly in Elizabeth, New Jersey, when a northbound train, the Admiral, entered the station just as people were crowding too close to the platform's edge. Despite braking and blowing its horn, it struck several people, two of which lost their lives. According to steamlocomotive.com, train movements were halted after the incident until Kennedy's train passed. It caused hours of delay, but the train continued. Photographer Paul Fusco was on board and took hundreds of images of America passing by out the windows. The photographs wouldn't be published widely until decades later, but they captured something raw. The train finally arrived at Washington's Union Station at 9:10 p.m., and Kennedy's casket was taken by motorcade to Arlington, so that he'd be laid to rest beside his brother in a nighttime ceremony lit by camera bulbs. The train itself didn't disappear. GG1, number 4903, one of the two lead locomotives, was preserved and now sits on display at the Museum of the American Railroad in Frisco, Texas. The observation car, where the casket was placed, known as business car number 120, survived as well and can now be found at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. After RFK, there would not be another funeral train for 49 years, but when the concept did return, it would look different, sleek, deliberate, and designed to ride across the Texan plains. George H.W. Bush passed away on November the 30th, 2018. After a state funeral in Washington, D.C., his body was flown to Texas for a final service in Houston. From there, the journey to his resting place would be by rail, which some perceived as a tribute to a tradition that had been dormant for nearly half a century. The funeral train, but in modern form. The train that carried him wasn't any locomotive. It was Pacific number 41041, an EMD diesel locomotive unveiled in 2005 and painted in the blue and white colors of Air Force One, bearing the name George Bush 41. Bush himself had taken a brief turn at the controls during its unveiling. After years in storage, the locomotive was brought back into service for this solemn occasion. On December the 6th, 2018, the 13-car funeral train departed from Spring, Texas, en route to College Station, a 70-mile journey that would take approximately 2.5 hours. And in keeping with tradition, the route passed through many towns where thousands of citizens lined the tracks to pay their respects. The casket was placed in a specially outfitted car with large plexiglass windows, allowing mourners to see the flag-draped coffin as it passed by. Upon arrival at Texas A&M University, Bush's casket was transferred to the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum, where he was laid to rest alongside his wife Barbara and his daughter Robin. Following the funeral, Union Pacific number 4141 was donated to the Bush Presidential Library. After a period of preparation, the locomotive was placed on permanent display at the museum in 2021, serving as a lasting tribute to the 41st President of the United States. So that's the story of funeral trains, from Lincoln's somber procession to Bush's final farewell. I hope you guys enjoyed the story, and I also hope you'll support us by subscribing. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.